Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tiki Bar. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Joe Aurilia. He is the SVP of Operations at Scyware. Joe, thanks so much for doing this today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Kevin. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. We ask everyone in the Tiki Bar the same first question. When you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Honestly, I wasn't quite sure. So when you say kid, you mean like kid or like high school kid?
What comes to mind, a kid first aspiration of like a career? You could be a baseball player. You can be whatever you want at this time. Something had to pop into your head when you were little.
I have a memory of thinking that I would be an artist, but you don't want me drawing anything, so I must have been really young when I thought that.
Okay, fair enough. And what ended up being the first job that you ever had as a kid?
I actually worked with my dad when I was very, very young. He had a home improvement company on the custom end home improvement. So I went to work with him very early. I learned everything from kitchens, baths, renovations, carpentry, painting, windows, doors, all high-end decoration kind of stuff. So it was a really good experience learning people, talking with people, fixing things. So very, very hands-on.
How old were you when you started doing that?
5.
So you're going to the job site and just doing whatever you can?
Yeah, and then each year kind of elevated from there. The toolbox got bigger, the responsibilities got bigger. So obviously when you're 5, you're not, ripping out a kitchen, of course. But as you got older, you got to do different things. You got to grow with what you're able to do by yourself, and just consistent learning from there until college. And then I switched to more technical things.
That's interesting. So your dad had that business the whole time throughout your whole childhood. That's part of your arc.
Yeah, he had that since I think the 70s or something. So he had that for decades.
What do you remember most about going to the job sites and doing the work? I would imagine you had other friends who aren't working when they're 5, 6 years old. So I would imagine you're kind of in the mix a little earlier.
It was just fun. Working with my dad was super fun. So you got to spend just a ridiculous amount of time together. So that's always, I think, the best part. And then you had to talk with people from all different walks of life, all different homes, all different ways of living. I mean, when you're entering someone's home, you're entering their most personal asset, right? You got to see all different ways people talk and communicate. So I think that really helped to open your eyes in terms of how you relay information, how you share information, how you convey the quality of work, right? You're going in to do something to change something structurally or to modify something. People need to trust you. They're watching you as you're doing it, right? So you have that pressure of, hey, did I cut that line correctly? Is that wood lined up? Is that door correct? Whatever it happens to be. So you're going to have to operate under pressure, I guess.
Absolutely. So what does that look like then when you're like kind of finishing up, when you're in high school? Presumably you've been around it for a while. You're probably like overseeing certain things. You've probably got like a real proper on-the-job education by that point.
Oh, by that point, yeah. I mean, that point, you do whatever you're doing by yourself. You can show up by yourself. You finish something, you knock it out. You're handling things. It's a whole different experience by that point.
Yeah, well, very cool. So then you go into college. Now, tell me about when you're heading into college. You mentioned you didn't know what you wanted to be when you were younger. Did you have a vision for your career when you're getting into the freshman orientation?
Yeah, to be honest, one of my dad's customers was throwing out an Apple IIe. They were the beige box computers back then. And I just simply fell in love with it. I did everything I could with it until it had no more capability left. Upgraded to a different model back then. I kept playing and playing, took a bunch of CS classes in high school. And then when it came time to make that decision, I was like, well, love computers, love messing around with them. Like, that's just a path, and just never looked back since.
What type of CS classes were you taking? Were they like, in a book? Were you going somewhere? What did that actually look like?
My high school actually had them. I feel
cool.
Maybe a little dated, but it was a C++, still exists. So you got to really do some, good, fun education at that point in time.
Okay, so you're already like in a midlife career state by the time you actually enter college. You've got like 10 years of working history in construction and home remodeling, and you've been training for CS. So then what's it like when you actually get into the major, start absorbing it? Do you want to stick with it? What does your interest level look like there?
One thing I learned is that originally when I started out with the classes in the first college, they were very theoretical, right? There's different levels of computer science and engineering courses. I found that I really loved the kind where you are actually creating something. You're building something for a business. You're seeing something grow. Wasn't really as much on like the quant type of math, the logical proof of every single algorithmic function that you were writing. That wasn't really as much of the fancy. I like to see things being created and to see things kind of growing and scaling. So that kind of changed the path to what type of classes were going to be taken, what type of roles were being looked for. That came to an understanding, I think, pretty quickly.
Okay. So you go through that path, graduate college, and then what is your first kind of real job, if you will, out of school?
During college, actually, I actually worked for one of the colleges for a number of years there on their LAMP stack. So what's that, Linux, Apache, something. It was a long time ago. But used to do Dreamweaver stuff, used to do a lot of web design and working on all of the different areas there. And back then, colleges didn't have front-end websites for their departments. So you were creating the first like online databases in order to access student information and sign up for activities and grow things. So it was really cool back then. So I did that for a number of years for that college. And then after that completed, the first official position after college was for AT&T Labs.
And so what's that like? So you've been in this pretty like entrepreneurial kind of mindset growing up, and then you're working with the college that you're part of, and then now you're in the big C, right? So what is that like for you to get into the big company? Is there an adjustment there?
It was different. I remember showing up, and it took them a number of weeks to even get me a computer. So I remember showing up, and I'm like, well, what would you like me to do? And they're like, well, you could read a book. And I'm like, you're kind of paying me a decent amount to say you read a book. They're like, well, we don't have a computer yet. We got to find one. I'm like, oh, okay. So that was kind of where you started, and I was like, quickly ramped up from there. But it took a while to just kind of like get yourself set up and get into the groove. And then once it started, it never stopped. We did a tremendous amount during those days.
What do you remember about like actually learning to kind of navigate the company once that initial shock wears off? Like, okay, things might take a little while. What's your experience like once you get off your heels?
Yeah, I mean, for that, we were in what they call like an ordering, workflow, and delivery segment of the lab. So we were responsible for maintaining all of the back-end systems that monitored and controlled essentially all of the ordering for AT&T, as well as all of the business intelligence, data warehousing, management, and also cleansing of the data across dozens and dozens of systems. So really what you learned was you had to communicate where things were going, where changes were happening. Incredibly thorough project management practices were there. Collaboration with other countries, collaboration with other teams. You're working with applications that maybe were created back in the 60s and other applications that were made last year. So all different languages and screen scraping. So keeping track of information was very key. Understanding what was important, ensuring that you ran up the chain risks that could occur. Back in that type of entity, you don't want a risk to occur. You can't take down an AT&T system, right? So ensuring that you are communicating, you're sharing, you're being aware, you're kind of just always on.
Yeah, makes sense. So you're no longer just the solo operator plowing through your CS learning courses. You got to figure out how to play the field and operate with systems across. That makes sense. So I want to get the chronology right on your next step. Did you go MBA and then to IBM, or was IBM the next step?
IBM was the next step. They actually did a swap. So a tremendous amount of employees from AT&T became IBM employees overnight, and then went back to work for AT&T. So it was an interesting thing. So you left work on a Monday as an AT&T employee. You came in on Tuesday, same team, same manager, but you were an IBM employee working full-time for AT&T. So
I've never heard of that. You were traded. You were like an NFL player.
It was almost like that, yeah. But then no press release, no jersey swap. A different email address for a little bit, but yeah, it was a very interesting kind of swap.
Were the companies commercially affiliated? Forgive me, I don't even know the corporate structure of those two companies.
So IBM has obviously a tremendously large global professional consulting company. So essentially, those of us in the labs, a certain percentage of us got moved into the consulting arm of IBM, which then worked for AT&T on a very large project. So essentially, you went from being a full-time employee of a telco to being a full-time employee of a global professional services company working specifically for a telco.
Okay. So what is that like? You're obviously a heads-down kind of guy. You've had jobs the whole time. You're getting used to the big company lifestyle. All of a sudden, there's a little shockwave, I would imagine, for your personal life. Hey, I'm at this new company now. I got to get my feet under me. What is that like?
Yeah, essentially you had two levels of management that you're working with, because you had now your client, and then you also had your existing company. So how you did things changed, how you monetize things, how you build things, how you structure things. Everything became a little bit different. So it's kind of weird when you're physically sitting at the same desk you were for the last X years, but now you work for a different company. You had to kind of retrain, what is a new process, what is a way of doing things, because even though you knew how to do it the other way, you had to do it like the new way. So everything became a modification for a while.
Well, that makes sense. And obviously it worked. You stuck around for a while. Was there like a moment where it clicked for you at IBM and you're like, okay, I'm gonna lean into this. I like doing this?
We got the opportunity in that time to work on a lot of the M&A integrations that were coming back into AT&T. So when the bells were coming back, all the software had to be merged, things had to be migrated. So my team in particular, which was more on the enterprise architecture side, we also got the pleasure of working on essentially all of the migrations. So you were talking about, these massive 24/7 high availability systems that had to be bashed back together or had to have data piped between them, where failure wasn't really an option. You can't drop orders, you can't drop communication. Everything was very critical. So you're handling a lot of sensitive data, a lot of information has to run correctly. So we're talking about intensive testing, right? You'd have people think they have their production system and their testing system. We had multiple layers of testing systems, pairwise testing, integration testing, UAT was everything. So it's a very almost like religious and methodical process to developing enterprise software, which really beats into the proper way to develop enterprise software, being cognizant of the risks, cognizant of the communication, the timelines, the security aspects, the rollouts, the documentation, the training. So if anything, I would say it's just, one of the best educations you could possibly get on how to try to do things the most proper way you can.
Was there a particular project that you remember that was most educational to you?
Oh, yes. It's fun. No one ever really wants to talk about that because some people consider it kind of boring, so thank you for asking. But we had to do a massive data center migration. So we used to have all of our servers in-house, and we moved it to a data center, and then we added high availability onto it. But it meant every single application had to be moved. Applications that hadn't been touched for a long time. Just imagine picking up like a flower pot that's been in your garden for a decade or two, and then you decide to upshift it to another state. That flower pot could have some issues, right? Yeah. So we had hundreds of integrations, terabytes of data, dozens of databases. It was the kind of thing where we actually planned out by the minute how things would work, how long it would take to send a tar file over the network pipe, how long it would take to unzip it and roll it out. So very methodical planning, very coordinated, weekend activity, people sleeping at the office. It was a very interesting mission, but it worked. It was all successful. Everything migrated over, and the system was bigger and stronger afterwards. So it was a really interesting experience.
Any apprehension for you once you have to sleep in the office a few times of like, do I want to keep doing this, or you loved it?
You were just used to it by that point. It wasn't. You were younger too, but you were kind of just used to it.
Well, so I want to talk a little more about that because I think most people don't understand what happens after, an M&A action, especially from a systems side. So when you talk to people about this, what do people not understand about what happens next? You
want things to happen at the click of a finger. The reality is that that's just not how it works. Anytime you try to rush something, especially at the data layer, especially for large enterprises with lots of moving parts or lots of integrations, things are bound to break. So the question really is stability. You want to protect the client. You want to make sure the client is having a phenomenal experience so that the client does not be impacted by your change in corporate letterhead. So understanding how you're going to modify these things in the background. How is the data going to be piped between different applications? What becomes the source of truth? What needs to be there for a redundancy point of view? How does the front end change? So it's really sitting down and asking those questions in a calm manner, as well as removing yourself from the personal attribution of a particular application. So, for example, let's say your application was the ABC application, right? And you might feel like your ABC application is the best. In a migration, your ABC application might die. So you have to be willing to understand that these things can be let go and that life changes. So when you look at it more from the business aspect and the client aspect and the go-forward aspect, and less from the fiefdom aspect, it's a much easier conversation. And then you have to go into obviously all the technicals about how to do this right. Do we have the right team? Do we have the right timing? Do we even understand where it is? Do we have documentation? Do we even have staff around it? So it's a lot of communication before you ever put hands on keyboard. Do you think that you would have been able to do all of those different facets? Obviously, you were primed for the technical work, but that client kind of relational side of it, the internal relation side of it, do you think that working, for your dad growing up and doing that much customer-facing stuff early prepared you to have that type of role? I think it helped a part of it. Certainly, some people are shy to get on the phone call or have a conversation or to speak up. I think it helped with that. So I do think a lot of the ways that work gets done and the way you communicate around challenging technical problems, I think you kind of learn that as you are proceeding. So there's vast learnings, I could say. I would thank AT&T for and IBM in every position where, in the moment, maybe things seem like a hot mess, but then you look back and like, I really did learn a lot of things I couldn't have learned elsewhere. So I think it's good for everybody to look back and say, what did I learn from this position? Or what did I learn from this person? Or what did I learn from this attitude? And then understand how to make that their own. It doesn't have to be exactly the same thing, but you got to take away something from it.
And was it during your IBM journey where you also went to go get your MBA?
I did. They were kind enough to let me go do that. There was an MBA in technology management at Stevens, nights and weekends, and it was a great experience. Very, very rigid course, very, very serious instructors with very serious goals that they laid out for us. So I can definitely say that the education was impactful.
What made it so serious?
They really wanted to focus on your ability as an executive leader to be able to handle any situation, even if you really didn't know what was going on. So understanding what are the key things that you need to ask to know enough information to make an intelligent and logical decision to move something forward and not be like a deer in headlights. I think that was the key, right? Obviously some of us are going to be more specialized on finance or technology or relations or what it happens to be. But as a leader, you do need to be the one to make a decision. So how do you know what to ask to get enough details to be able to make that first step in the decision so you're not stuck?
And were you then leading people at IBM at that point, or was that after?
I had teams in AT&T and IBM that were leading from a technology point of view. Obviously, team size grows over time, but even in those entities, we had teams in the U.S. that we were running, as well as teams overseas that we were also responsible for.
Okay, so you were running teams the whole time. Well, how would you describe your own managerial arc? Who was Joe, the manager, early days, AT&T versus where he is at IBM at this point?
I think different. I think more of an arc probably from the AT&T IBM days to the careers that came afterwards. But those days, the entities were just incredibly technical. So all the conversations were technical. All the conversations were related to dates and functions and sprints and everything else. And that kind of sets a particular mindset around what you're doing. I think as you move into later careers and you're working more on the entire business at a larger scale, the management becomes much more, I think, difficult as well as much more comprehensive.
What do you think makes it more difficult?
When you're worried about all aspects of the business, when you have that C-level position or you have that ownership position, everything becomes your responsibility. So you're not just worrying about whether or not the physical product works. You're worrying about, is the marketing right? Is the staffing levels out right? Is the funding right? How's the bank account looking? What kind of taxes do we have to worry about? What kind of regulation or permissions or security or compliance? So the whole world becomes a challenge. It's not a challenge for every single employee, but it's your challenge. So you need to understand what you should be talking about with each individual directly, what their responsibilities are, as well as also handling the human aspect of employment, right? Hiring, firing, letting go, performance, all those things kind of fold into the same exact story and sometimes at the same exact time.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you take kind of a pivot here is what I understand in your next step, and I'm just looking from LinkedIn. But you're on executive tracks early at AT&T. You fulfill those executive tracks at IBM, very prestigious companies, and then you take a leap and start your own business. Can you tell the story of what that was?
Yeah, people do refer to that as a pivot. Obviously, having worked with my dad's company in the beginning, I also had a few other companies throughout the course of time on the consulting side, the iPhone side, some other things earlier on. There was an opportunity that seemed to be great for individuals and for a company as a whole. So I was presented with the idea of the renewable energy. I researched to death the financials behind it, the logic, the business plan. It sounded logical to me. It sounded like something that could work. So I built it out beforehand to make sure that it actually made sense. I had to make sure the numbers were actually, pencil out. And then I partnered with a few other folks to create the entity. And then we grew that out over the course of 8 or so years. So we scaled it out to about 3 different states, about 800 different AHJs, which would be kind of like little areas of each state. Residential, commercial, nonprofit, worked with over 300 partners, tremendous number of finance companies and investors, and we really focused on ensuring that customers received a high-value product as well as a high-value quantity of savings. So we really made sure the math was religiously correct, that the integrity of our proposals were correct, that the quality of the install, and that allowed us to be successful in that way. And then what I realized, honestly, not until many years after we left that business, was that we built a revenue operations focused company by accident. RevOps wasn't a name back then. It didn't exist. We just had a really simple story. We said we care about the customer. We put them in the center. We're technical. I don't like doing things twice. We're going to do it in Salesforce. Became a Salesforce architect and automated everything in Salesforce. And then looking back, that was a RevOps focused company without actually realizing it. So we piped everything through Salesforce, everything from call centers, all of our data mapping, our contracts, our quoting, our analysis, everything was in that one system. And that allowed us to really scale in a way that would not have been possible without a significant amount of additional money and headcount.
Oh, that's awesome. I missed something there in my research. It sounds like you had some entrepreneurial experimentation even before this. You mentioned the iPhone and some consulting. Can you tell us just about your background there?
Yeah, I mean, me and a few other friends, we did start one of the, when iPhones first came out, everyone had to create an app. So we started to create an app or two. That wasn't as large of an enterprise. That kind of fizzled out a little bit. We were all working other jobs, weren't able to kind of spend enough time. So that didn't last as long. But did have a consulting company for about 20 years, parallel to the other positions I did with nights and weekends. So did that helping small to medium-sized businesses, everything from technical consulting, managerial consulting, business type conversations. And I ran that for quite a while until, later on where I moved and it wasn't feasible at that time.
Okay. All right. And so I want to zoom into Ecoman a little bit more because I love the story of like you're kind of developing this RevOps functions before it really exists. You leave IBM, you've done all the preparation that you can. Surely once you get in and actually start running things, it's probably different in some ways than you had imagined. What was the biggest transition point for you from working for IBM to now running your own show?
You had to touch everything, which wasn't unexpected, but there's a lot of things to touch. And when you sit down and you start to document everything that needs to happen, you realize that you have more things to happen than you have bodies to work on it. And that becomes a challenge. So prioritizing what needs to occur, what doesn't need to occur. A lot of lessons I think learned, during that time. I learned very much not to build everything at once. Sometimes you have to kind of take a wing on certain things. If you build it and it takes forever, that doesn't also work as well. So really, understanding the pace of innovation relative to the pace of the sales machine. So, obviously in the more technical side, you weren't really selling, so to speak. Whereas in the other entity on the renewable side, you are doing selling as well. So besides the position I had and everything else, I've done all the other works. I've done door-to-door sales, super fun. I've done $1 million sales. I've done everything in between. And understanding the sales motion was definitely a learning experience. Understanding why you pay someone commission, the value of it, the value of their experience, the value of the networking conversation. That was a huge learning. I think once I was able to understand that, which took some time, and then marry that understanding into the business operations component, and then the automation part on the side of that, the unison of those things, I think was really the change that didn't exist beforehand, because I didn't physically understand the sales motion, and then understanding it really kind of modified how I thought about the next business and the next activities.
So when you say understand the sales motion, you mentioned door-to-door sales and that it was super fun. I assume you're being sarcastic. Did you actually go and you're knocking door-to-door, selling solar panels?
I've done that as well. I've done a door-to-door. I've done the business sales. I've done the more expensive ones. So I got to try and taste all of them. Door-to-door can be interesting. You have to be comfortable knowing that the homeowner will walk to the door, the glass door, you both can see each other, and then they just turn around and walk away without answering it. And you have to not think less of yourself when that occurs.
Was that an adjustment for you at all to get into that sales mindset? You've been technical, operational your whole career, or was that natural given your
the sales part wasn't something that was foreign in terms of being overly cumbersome. It was really the understanding of all the motions around it that required some learnings. Not knowing all of the different ways you can coordinate a sale, move pieces around, the triggers that you use to kind of alter conversations. I think that's where most of the learning came.
Yeah, I love that when operators go through that because they just have such a clearer story of how the sausage is made, so to speak. I want to kind of fast forward a bit to now. What ultimately then drew you to Cyware?
Yeah, we had been in that business for a number of years. We saw the market changing in certain ways, and we had a really good ride, and we were all looking and saying, okay, we did this. It's been a while. We're looking to do what our next journeys will be for each of us. Also in that business, you kind of have a client, and there is no recurring revenue, right? You kind of do it, it works, then you kind of go away. So it wasn't like you had a large thing to clean up, which was very accommodating. Through networking, I had found the company here, where I am at the moment. They were looking for someone to come in as a first U.S. employee. They had a team in India, about 50, making the MVP. Been around for a little bit, just got their seed funding of $3 million, and they wanted to have everything grown as fast as physically possible and as scalable as physically possible. No one told me COVID was coming a few months later, which threw a little bit of a monkey wrench into the mix. But having just built the other company and enjoyed that experience, and foolishly wanting to do that a second time, as some would say, I said yes. And that's what we did. The team did a phenomenal job. They did a lot of work during the COVID time, did 2 rounds during that time, 3 rounds in total, so our A, B, and our C. I got to work on all of those, which I think due diligence is a really fun activity. I know that's not really a common phrase, but as an operator, due diligence is like going for your physical. You get to find out how healthy your machine is. And so even though it's hard, it's painful, there's lots of questions, if you pass it and then you learn how to do them over and over again, you really get to understand the ways that you create an entity and the ways that you combine the people, process, and technology in the entity to allow those future strategic conversations to be successful. So I think that was a very important learning. And then obviously owning all the various operational teams, from soup to nuts on the inside, the hiring, the IT, procurement, RevOps, legal, all the kind of fun stuff. You really just get a tremendous amount of things to work on over the course of time.
And so you mentioned, doing it again, you're crazy for doing it, which I resonate with. That makes sense to me. What's then driving your curiosity? You've sampled everything. You've leaned all the way into everything. You've done door-to-door sales all the way to, back-end engineering of incredibly complex systems. So what is it that is making you want another opportunity like this?
Yeah, and this hit, I think, a different segment, which makes really confusing to folks when you look at all the different pivots and different capabilities. So you look at AT&T and IBM and you say, okay, well, you have the very large, very, very corporate behemoths. Then you have, renewables, which is, okay, you're starting from scratch. You're much on the smaller side. You're doing, small clients, homeowners, as well as, some commercial entities. And then this, which is more of the, really high-end commercial conversation. So the world's largest logos, the most complex legal conversations of risk. So you're doing it again, but you're doing it in a different flair. So you're getting to cover another host segment of the market, another host segment of potential challenges that need to be solved. So essentially kind of really rounding out the capabilities of starting companies at all different levels.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. Okay, now, so I met you through a revenue operation event, and you were talking about compliance, privacy, and risk in revenue operations. I thought this was really kind of a smart topic for right now, because that's not really what people are talking about, right? They're talking about what you were doing years ago, which is automating everything. And I feel like you're kind of bringing sort of an elevated lens through which to view this. Why do you think that is a topic that needs to be highlighted right now?
I personally believe that the topic should be highlighted. I know a lot of folks don't fancy it as much because it's not fun, it's not attractive, it's not, a wow moment, right? Everyone wants to say, I did this new AI thing and I automated half my team away, and everyone claps in the corner. But the reality is that, nowadays there's a lot of risk in companies, and not in a negative way, but in a way that there's an expectation of being perfect all the time, of being secure all the time, of having the answer needed for a client all the time. So we've been automating things for decades, right? That's not foreign to us. Now automating things even faster. You do need to consider the fact that as we create more automation, as we bring in a faster level of change with perhaps a much smaller level of consideration beforehand on what it takes to make that change, where data gets modified, who owns it, what's the permission levels, what's the risk, what's the backup strategy, where's the sharing kind of happening. You are opening yourself up to a greater amount of potential compliance obligations that you're not really fully cognizant of when you release that modification within the company. So I think as revenue operators, most particularly, is that we have, in my opinion, sometimes more data than the finance team, which is not something that people really talk as loudly about, right? Finance has the numbers at the end. They don't exactly have, as you mentioned, how the sausage is cooked. They don't have the whole end-to-end component, whereas we technically do. We touch all of those systems. So the more you automate those systems, the more you try to create efficiencies, which again is good, right? I'm not saying that's bad, but being cognizant of who owns the data, what data is being changed, how do things happen? If something doesn't work from an automated point of view, can we still fix it? That is still the RevOps team responsibility. Let's continue with these things, but be cognizant of the changes you're making, be cognizant of the documentation, be cognizant of where the data is being shared, because at some point you will be asked those questions. It's much easier to answer them now than answer them, on the day something bad happens.
Absolutely. Now, if you're looking back to Joe again when he's kind of just coming out of school and gearing up for AT&T, what advice would you give to your younger self now that you've kind of been through so much?
Definitely should have networked more. Wasn't really something anyone talked about back then. So you kind of stood in your lane, you did what you did, but you really didn't kind of expand out past that. I think in the later years, when I kind of learned that lesson, eventually, there's a great amount of information you can get from others, others in different fields, different disciplines, different states, different countries. And whether it sounds like the information that they share or communicate is relevant at that point in time, what really happens is that your brain remembers it. You pick up on what they're saying, you pick up on the methods and techniques that they're working on, and you tend to incorporate those later on when a problem happens. So I think by going down that path, by having these conversations, whether it's networking, communities, events, whatever it happens to be, a podcast like this, you're really opening your brain to a whole bunch of information, typically free information, that can make you more well-rounded going forward.
No, absolutely. And on the topic of information, my last question is always a very selfish one. I get to talk to interesting people and interview them on this show. So what is a piece of content? Could be a book, movie, podcast, song, whatever you want. Bonus points if it's not business related, that you find yourself just recommending to everyone.
It's an interesting question. I used to read prolifically, more on the technical side. And then once you got more into the other side, the time tends to change a bit. And also with the way content is delivered tends to change a bit. I think even more important than the reading or a book, everyone wants to have something physical in their hand. I think almost stepping away from all of that is really the missing component. Like just put your laptop down for a moment and just go for a walk or go for a hike for an hour and come back. Just let your brain reset without the technology, without the feel that you need to consume something, because sometimes consuming nothing actually provides the biggest benefit.
That's the most meta answer that we've gotten on that question so far, Joe. I like that, and I absolutely agree with you wholeheartedly. Joe, thanks so much for doing this. We'll hope to catch you at another event soon and have you on again sometime.
Thank you, Kevin. Awesome. Thanks so much.